The wind howled across the barren Wyoming plain, carrying the bitter sting of loneliness that clung to Amos Reed like dust on his weathered boots. At 42, the cowboy's face was etched with lines deeper than the canyons, each one a testament to a life spent wandering, searching for something he couldn't name. But tonight, in the flickering light of a saloon's lantern, Amos found himself staring into the wide, frightened eyes of a girl no older than 16, her hands bound with coarse rope, her dress tattered and thin. She was being sold like cattle, by a woman with a slurred voice and whiskey on her breath, who claimed to be her stepmother. The crowd jeered, but Amos's heart thudded with a strange, unshakable certainty. He couldn't walk away. Amos had ridden into the small town of Bitter Creek that morning, his only companion a bay mare named Sable. He'd planned to restock his supplies and move on, as he always did, chasing the horizon. But the saloon's raucous noise had drawn him in, and there she was, Lila, though he wouldn't learn her name until later, standing on a makeshift stage, trembling. The stepmother, a woman named Gert, rambled about Lila's deafness, how she was useless but pretty enough to fetch a price. Amos's fists clenched. He'd seen cruelty before, but this was different. Something about Lila's eyes, wide and searching, pierced him. Without thinking, he tossed his last $50 onto the table, more money than he'd seen in months. The crowd fell silent. Gert cackled, untied the girl, and shoved her toward him. Lila stumbled, and Amos caught her, feeling her thin frame shake under his calloused hands. He led her outside, away from the saloon's stench and leering eyes. The night was cold, and Lila had no coat. Amos draped his own jacket over her shoulders, noticing how she flinched at his touch. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said softly, though he realized she couldn't hear him, or so he thought. He took her to the boarding house where he'd rented a room, paying extra for a cot for her. She sat there, knees drawn up, staring at the floor. Amos didn't know what to do. He wasn't a father, wasn't even a friend to anyone. He was just a drifter, a man who'd buried his past in the dust of 1,000 trails. But as he watched Lila, he felt a tug, like a rope pulling him toward a purpose he'd long forgotten. The first challenge came at dawn. Lila wouldn't eat. Amos had bought bread and cheese, but she pushed the plate away, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting Gert to barge in. He tried gesturing, mimicking eating, but she only shrank further into herself. Frustrated, Amos sat across from her, wondering if he'd made a mistake. He didn't know how to care for a deaf girl, let alone one who looked like she'd rather bolt than trust him. That afternoon, he took her to the general store to buy her a proper dress and shoes. The shopkeeper, a kindly woman named Mrs. Harrow, noticed Lila's silence and suggested writing notes to communicate. Amos bought a small slate and chalk, and that evening, he scratched out, "You safe now?" "What's your name?" Lila stared at the words, her fingers trembling as she took the chalk and wrote, "Lila." It was the first time Amos saw her face soften, and his chest ached with something he hadn't felt in years, hope, but hope was fragile, and the next challenge hit hard. Word of Amos buying Lila had spread, and the townsfolk whispered. Some called him a savior, others, a fool, or worse. A man named Clyde, a rancher with a mean streak, cornered Amos outside the livery stable. "You think you can play hero, drifter? That girl's trouble. Her stepmama says she's cursed, can't hear a thing, can't work. You're stuck with a burden." Amos's jaw tightened, but he didn't swing. He'd learned long ago that fists didn't change minds. Instead, he walked away, but Clyde's words gnawed at him. What if he couldn't provide for Lila? He had no land, no home, just a horse and a saddlebag. That night, he sat by the fire, watching Lila sleep, and wondered if he was selfish for keeping her with him. Days turned to weeks, and Amos and Lila fell into a quiet rhythm. He taught her to ride Sable, guiding her hands on the reins. She was a quick learner, her fear giving way to a shy smile when the mare obeyed her. Amos found himself talking to her, even though he thought she couldn't hear. He told her about the stars, about the trails he'd ridden, about the brother he'd lost to fever years ago. One evening, as he recounted a story about a stubborn mule, Lila laughed, a soft, clear sound that stopped him cold. He stared at her, heart pounding. "You heard that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lila's eyes widened, and she clapped a hand over her mouth, as if she'd betrayed a secret. The revelation changed everything. Lila could hear, not perfectly, but enough. She'd been hiding it, Amos realized, maybe to protect herself from Gert's cruelty or the world's expectations. The next challenge was trust. Amos didn't push her to explain, but he started speaking to her directly, watching her reactions. Slowly, she began to respond, her voice hesitant, like a bird testing its wings. She told him how Gert had married her father, a kind man who'd died 2 years ago. Gert had turned mean, drinking away their money, and when Lila's hearing began to fade after a fever, Gert called her useless, forcing her to play deaf to avoid beatings. Amos's blood boiled, but he kept his anger in check, focusing on Lila. He promised her she'd never go back to that life, but the past wasn't done with them. One morning, Gert showed up at the boarding house, drunk and demanding Lila back. "She's mine, cowboy," Gert slurred, her breath reeking. "You stole her." Amos stood firm, blocking the door, but Lila froze, her face pale. The townsfolk gathered, some siding with Gert, saying his stepmother had rights. The sheriff, a tired man named Hollis, arrived, unsure how to settle it. Amos felt the weight of his choice. $50 didn't make Lila his, not legally. Desperate, he turned to Mrs. Harrow, who'd grown fond of Lila. She rallied the women of Bitter Creek, who testified to Gert's neglect and cruelty. Lila, trembling but brave, spoke up, her voice soft but clear, telling the sheriff how Gert had sold her. The crowd fell silent. Hollis ordered Gert out of town, warning her never to return. Lila clung to Amos, tears streaming down her face, and he knew then he'd fight the world to keep her safe. The final challenge was Amos himself. He'd saved Lila, but what could he offer her? He was a loner, unfit for a family. Yet Lila needed a home, a future. One night, as they sat by the fire, she wrote on the slate, "Why you help me?" Amos hesitated, then told her the truth. Years ago, he'd had a daughter, Ellie, who died of smallpox at 6. He'd blamed himself, ridden away from his grief, and never looked back. "You remind me of her," he said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't save Ellie, but I can save you." Lila reached for his hand, her touch steadying him. In that moment, Amos realized he wasn't just saving her, she was saving him, too. They left Bitter Creek in spring, heading to Montana, where Amos had heard of land for homesteading. He built a small cabin, and Lila planted a garden, her laughter filling the air. She still struggled with her hearing, but Amos learned to face her when he spoke, and she grew bolder, her voice stronger. They weren't father and daughter, not by blood, but by choice, a bond forged in the dust of a saloon and the courage to trust again. Amos, once a lonely cowboy, found his purpose in Lila's smile, and she, once a frightened girl, found her voice in his care. Years later, when Lila married a kind blacksmith and held her own daughter, she told the story of the cowboy who'd bought her freedom and taught her to listen, not just with her ears, but with her heart. And Amos, gray-haired but content, watched from the porch, knowing he'd finally found the home he'd been searching for. The wind still howled across the plains, but it no longer carried loneliness, only the echo of a life redeemed by love.